I think there's a whole new professional world that, is a little bit overwhelming
Yeah.
to deal with. But I think great storytelling is in its, still in its golden era.
Welcome to the Storycraft podcast for storytellers. I'm your host, Meg Adams, and I'm here to help you explore how stories shape our connections. Wondering how stories help you network and advance? Looking to bridge online and face-to-face worlds, foster understanding, and ignite innovation? Look no further. Whether you're a leader, communicator, educator, or just love a good story, join us for actionable insights and real talk with professional storytellers, all aimed at helping you build stronger, better connections. All right, so I am joined today with Natan Edelsburg. He is Chief Partnership Officer at Muck Rack and was their very first employee in 2009. He talks and speaks about the future of TV, PR, journalism, and the evolution of the media industry. So welcome, Natan. So excited to talk to you about all those topics today. And we met at PRSA. Yeah, we met at PRSA, and I loved your presentation. A lot of your presentation focused on the data that you'd collected at Muck Rack. So I do want to get into that today to help our listeners learn more about how to be more strategic in their pitching and they're getting their stories out there. But I wanted to just go back a little bit for listeners. I always love to give context so people understand your perspective and the sort of the lens that you bring to storytelling. So could you tell us, this is like such a big question, briefly about how you started your career in storytelling and where you are now?
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad we were able to connect at PRSA and stay in touch. So I think my storytelling, career started in college. I went to NYU and I studied in their media culture and communications program. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life or career. I kind of just found myself in that program because I was lucky that I got in, but also I had two big influences in my life push me that direction who are also career storytellers. My grandfather was in public relations for 40 years and was Harold Burson from now Burson Conan Wolf's one of his first employees and was there for 40 years and was a pioneer in the PR world. And my mother also worked at a PR agency at MSL Group, now owned by Publicis, for 25, 30 years. So I was around professional storytellers my whole life in all different capacities. And I thought, well, why not try this out? But before I found myself back in kind of public relations and communications, I really wanted to write and kind of be a journalist.
Yeah.
And I found that, sorry, perfect time to lose my voice.
Right.
I found that when I wanted to become a journalist at NYU, I reached out to the student newspaper and I didn't really hear back. The student newspaper, is still printed in those days, not that all that long ago, but 2 decades ago, decade and a half ago. And I didn't hear back, but there was this kind of emerging blog because at the time it was like 2005, 2006, blogs were becoming really popular. And there was a blog that had taken off at NYU that was a kind of, mix between like Gawker, BuzzFeed, and HuffPost that was a little bit more exciting. I heard back from them right away and I started writing about entertainment. I loved watching TV shows and I loved writing about them because I both loved the storytelling of TV, which is why I was and am obsessed with it. And it happened to be that, the show Gossip Girl happened to be airing that year, the season that the characters were going to NYU. So I felt it very appropriate. In my first post, I kind of felt the weight of like being a journalist for the first time. And I had to make this tell a really good story. So I did a huge analysis. I think I was up to like 4 a.m. spending 4 hours on this kind of silly blog post, comparing Gossip Girl's representation of NYU to the actual NYU. And I had some, snarky bits in it that were, NYU would never allow a rooftop party because there were unfortunately too many kids like falling off roofs at the time and kind of, things maybe I regret a little bit putting on paper, but that were very true.
Sure.
And the New York Post picked up the blog post the next day and put it in print. And I was kind of like shocked. I was like, Oh my God, like, yeah, someone else thought this was maybe a good story.
Yeah.
And so that was really, a pivotal moment because it inspired me as an undergrad, that I could make an impact, and really felt that, like, the city was at my fingertips. Being a lifelong New Yorker, I always believed that NYU was the center of media and storytelling, but I hadn't personally experienced it yet. Um, and that's kind of what catapulted me into wanting to continue to be in all different types of careers, and to really be obsessed and have a passion of telling great stories, whether it was as a journalist, in PR, in sales, in marketing, writing great emails. And I think, many times that I speak to students I've mentored or people that I've supported earlier in their careers, the one thing they always give me credit is, like, you taught me how to write a good email. And I take
Nice.
that very proudly, because I care a lot about writing good emails, and that is, to me, one of the most important storytelling we do in our daily lives, even if it's not kind of the traditional kind of story you think about, which is, something that maybe gets published.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for that story. Yeah, it's amazing. I think we were probably grew up in the same era. I graduated college in 2007, also wrote for a newspaper. And so,
Cool.
it seems like I teach as well. So I remind students all the time, you just have no idea like how much has changed in a scope of, I don't feel that old, Natan. I don't know about you. I still feel like I'm young. I'm like, I
Me
don't feel
too.
old, but I feel like so
Yeah.
much has changed, like over the in terms of communication and the way we communicate. Like you mentioned, an email that was important when we were in school, certainly. But I'd love to hear more from you about, being in storytelling professionally for this long. Like, what do you think are the most significant changes in terms of storytelling from your perspective, and how can people be more strategic and effective at storytelling in this day and age? I know it's a broad
Sure.
question, but
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, I think the biggest changes that have happened, and I too still feel young, even though I have, three kids and a mortgage.
yeah.
But yeah, I think the biggest thing that has changed are, the mediums to which we have storytelling. A big message in my undergrad was, the medium is the message,
Yes.
and very famous kind of storytelling
Mhm.
phrase. But I think it was maybe Marshall McLuhan, or I forget who
Yeah.
it was. Yeah,
Yeah.
Marshall. Okay, see, I learned something in
You
college.
did.
I did. My professors will be very happy to hear that. But I think for me, when I was graduating, it was Twitter coming on the scene.
Mhm.
Today, it's TikTok, and generative AI, and
Mhm.
that is impacting how, two examples of how it's impacting stories, where it's not enough just to be a great writer, just to have great ideas, just to be creative. It's important to really understand the medium that you're producing content on. If it's TikTok, you have to be silly. You have to have great video editing skills. And unfortunately, sometimes, that platform leads to not paying attention to facts as much, or things
Mhm.
going viral that aren't necessarily truthful. When it comes to generative AI, you have a great assistant at your fingertips to help you with storytelling, but you have to use it responsibly. And I think it's possible to. I think there's great opportunities to, but I also think there's opportunities to abuse it. And right now,
Mhm.
it's pretty easy to tell if you didn't write something
Yeah.
versus prompted a bot to write it. But I'm sure, as the years go on, it's going to be harder to tell the difference. And that's going to impact things too. So I think a lot about how, storytelling, and tying back to Muck Rack a bit, a lot of our research that we produce, which helps us inform what to build and helps us educate PR professionals and journalists on the state of the industry, is saying these exact kinds of things.
So tell me more about what, about Muck Rack in general for the audience, and then a little more about what you are doing to stay, on the cusp of things and to serve your audience, your clients better.
Sure. So Muck Rack is a platform for public relations professionals. Like, the short way we describe it is, we enable organizations to build trust, tell their stories, and demonstrate the unique value of earned media. And we help businesses do this, and we help them grow by examples are generating positive media coverage, monitoring, mentions across news and journalists, and tracking then the impact that they have from that. So for us, storytelling is like the biggest asset that we want to support our clients in doing with our technology. And Muck Rack monitors over 600,000 global media sources to help people do that, and we have the most up-to-date database in the industry. And we use all different types of cutting edge technologies to help people find the right journalists to pitch their stories to. So that's a little bit of background on Muck Rack.
And so I know, I've taught and been a journalist and in public relations as well. And I'm curious to know, with the work that you do at Muck Rack and as you've done throughout your career, you mentioned email, but what are some of the most effective ways to storytell with so many options? I think it can feel really overwhelming for people trying to do this on their own. There's so many components besides just, as you mentioned, getting the writing and the storytelling correct.
Yeah, pitching is really hard. You can have the best story in the world, but if you can't get anyone to read it, it's going to be hard. I think maybe ironically, over 90% of the response of our surveys still say pitching over email is best. So this is what journalists are saying they prefer, and what public relations professionals are still using. And I think, for better or worse, email is private. It's it's the best thing we have right now. I think there's a big difference between once you have a relationship with someone versus while you're trying to build one. So once you know someone already, similar in personal relationships, maybe you move off of email and get their phone number and text more, or use private messaging on a social network to do so. But I think with new pitches, when you're trying to engage with someone you don't know, email is certainly best. And then I think there are other ways to kind of like cut through the noise. None of it's going to be perfect, but really thinking about the best time of day to pitch, how long or short your pitch should be, also has a huge impact. One going back to your question about what's changed, like 92% of journalists prefer that pitches are 300 words or less.
Wow.
Not like 3 paragraphs, 300 words. So
right.
I think that's a huge impact of social media and short form communication to actually be able to tell your story in a really short way and open people up to learn more. But that's another kind of impactful data point we always highlight, because it's easy when you have a lot to say to put it all out there, but you have to try and hold yourself back until someone agrees to open the door to their virtual house and let you in, so you could share more than those initial 300 words.
Yeah, the pitch is all about that hook, right? Or that tease. Yeah. So you said your mentors told you that you gave away the secrets to writing the best emails. And what is your, beyond that, right? That was very helpful to think of 300 words. I think also in today's day and age, people are becoming better at getting focused. You just have to be really focused and really clear in what you're trying to say. And I've taught, well, my PhD is in writing. So I always tell people, like, that's often much harder than writing the 3 paragraphs, writing the 3 sentences and distilling your idea down. So yeah, I'm just curious at what your advice is to getting, and then I think part of it too is getting people to open the email, like you mentioned. That's half the battle there as well.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think a lot of my, email tips that I've given people over the years is 100% keeping them very short. So, using, those insights from the research I mentioned, that's extremely important. Keeping them short is a big one. Follow-up strategies is another really important one. You want to follow up with people in a respectful and helpful way that recognizes how broken email can be and how easy it is to miss something. I miss emails all the time and I regret it and wish I didn't, but also not doing it too much where you hurt a relationship and break one. But when it comes to the storytelling in the email itself, in addition to kind of like experience as a journalist early on in my career and after college, I freelanced for a bunch of years for Adweek and then the Drum, where I had a deadline and editors and headlines and all the great stuff that comes to being a journalist. I truly saw the other side of it. But when it comes specifically to emails, I believe in this kind of concept that I learned called answer first communications. It was something that was drilled into me during a short PR gig I had at Bain and Company, the management consultancy, as a PR assistant. Very, very, important management consultancy, very, very corporate environment, which I learned a lot, but decided, wasn't right for me. And I had an amazing, manager there who taught me how to write good emails and taught me to put the answer first at the beginning of the email. A lot of times people bury the lead and they don't think like a journalist. When you're a journalist, you're trained to do the opposite of burying the lead and to have a headline and to be clear up front. But I think when people write emails, not everyone has that kind of journalism training. And I very, very much believe that, you need to give all this context and you're saving your question for the end or your main point for the end. I've trained people to flip it around. And even if you have to write it that way first, write your kind of messy, long email and then flip it around and make it clear, whether it's asking your question at the very beginning or putting the most important thing. And I think just getting people to realize when you're writing anything to anyone, you're your own editor and the journalist, and you're trying to come across there, especially if you're pitching a story as PR, or you're doing sales and trying to get someone to open up an email to learn about your product. Those kinds of principles are very important. I usually would tell people whatever they wrote, cut that email in half. Just cut it in half, and then I'll review it. And really trying, you tell someone make an email 3 to 5 sentences. It ends up being 5 to 10 sentences, and I would really refuse to review it until it was actually 3 to 5 sentences. So that was kind of my policy on emails. But I think at the end of the day, it has to be a good pitch too. And so the customizing, the making it relevant, most journalists say in our research that it's the lack of relevancy and the bad timing, which is why they reject otherwise relevant pitches. And I think that's something that's extremely important to remember. Even if you've done all the things I mentioned, it could still be bad storytelling if you don't do those 2 things.
Love what you're hearing on this podcast? Consider booking me to speak at your next event. Dive further into the transformative power of storytelling with my keynote. Tell better stories, speak up, stand out, and build community. In a world that often amplifies our differences, my talk invites you to embrace genuine connections. Break free from the echo chambers and discover the art of storytelling. Learn how to share your own narrative, listen actively, and foster communities that flourish on shared experiences. Check out the show notes to learn more about how to book a talk for your next event. There are so many ways to contact people, right? I know you said email's the best. You talked about it has to be relevant and it has to be the right time, and you have to have a follow-up strategy. So what is your advice in terms of maybe to someone who might be new in the field, or they're just not getting the response from the pitches that they would like? What's a good follow-up strategy? And then I know that I've gotten this advice in sales, so I'm curious to know what you think. You also talked about building relationships. So how persistent and consistent are you when following up? Do you have any insight on strategies there for people?
Yeah, so it's hard to know exactly what works, but I think like the one piece of insight I have is what journalists tell us. And journalists say like over 90% of them say that it's okay to send them, their first follow-up 3 to 6 days later. So I think at the very least, one follow-up should be built into everything that you do.
Yeah.
In Muck Rack, when it comes to pitches journalists, we make it really easy to do that. So it's not complicated or cumbersome too. You don't have to like spend hours going through your outbox to try and find all the emails. But in general, I think, a couple of follow-ups is okay if you spread them out and make them customized and respectful. Write your follow-ups as if you're talking to someone in person. If you wouldn't feel comfortable following up with someone with that language in person, maybe don't put it in an email. So sometimes I think when people follow up, it unintentionally comes across as a bit rude or impatient. And I think you have to go out of your way to use kind language when following up. Maybe that's, exclamation marks if you're like me and has a bubbly email personality, or maybe it's
Yeah.
emojis if you feel comfortable doing that with the person, or maybe it's just I noticed, it was the holidays, you might have been busy, I'm sorry I emailed you then, wanted to just make sure you saw this, or I missed that you were out of the office then, I just saw that auto response for you, so I wanted to put this at the top of your inbox. I think there's a big debate to which maybe you change the subject line or not.
Mm-hmm.
I personally don't like changing the subject line because I like threads. Some people hate threads, and I find it might be more confusing to de-thread it. But other people think, well, if they missed that subject line the first time, maybe I should try something new, and that's fair too. I think sometimes you gotta do that. So I think those are a couple of different ways, but make sure in between your follow-ups, you're checking like the person or journalist or whoever you can, check their social media if they're public, check if they're publishing content, because maybe they're just out and you could tell by the fact that they haven't published in 2 weeks that they've likely been on vacation. Or maybe they're just so overwhelmed covering some breaking news, there's just no chance that they're going to respond to you. So, use tools to help be more efficient, and that's what we believe in, but really treat everyone like an individual and customize so there's a better chance.
I really love that advice too. I think just thinking about how you would speak to someone professionally in person and to come across as a human. You mentioned AI, and I'm sure everybody listening has been the recipient of one of those emails that's like written and copy pasted, and that's not fun. Nobody likes reading those. So I love that advice for the follow-up too. And I think I would agree with you. The more warm somebody sounds, the more intentional and personalized it is, the more likely I'm going to respond, especially if I don't know you in person. So that I appreciate that. Switching gears a little bit, Natan, I was super excited to talk to you today too, about your thoughts on the evolution of storytelling. Like I mentioned earlier, we've talked a lot about, or a little bit about our careers and kind of being the same time where we've seen such feels like expedited technological shift in terms of storytelling and communication. And so I'm curious just to know like what your thoughts are on the present state of storytelling, and what do you think the future is going to look like?
Yeah, I think the present state of storytelling is at a pivotal turning point, probably as much as it was when I was starting my career in like 2006, 2007 with social media coming on the scene, because there's so many newer ways to tell stories. And, besides the ones I already mentioned, generative AI impacting it, something like TikTok. I think even the fact that newsletters are becoming extremely important and big again to consume content. Podcasts like your own are becoming extremely more important. We've seen hundreds of thousands of new podcasts added within Muck Rack, that people in our client base care about. So I think that the fact that we have to learn new mediums to tell stories is probably one of the biggest things and evolutions that I'm seeing. I think the good news is that we have more capabilities at our fingertips than ever before. So there's easier ways to learn how to be great storytellers, to get more instant feedback, to try out different things, to do it at a low cost. It's much easier to do that. And I think that creates big opportunities for everyone, whether it's on a public basis, if you want to become a creator or an influencer, but also on a private scale too. 5 years ago when my grandfather I mentioned turned 95, my cousin and I made a mini family documentary about him. We filmed him about his life. He was had served in World War II and worked on the Manhattan Project. He had this amazing career. He did a lot of advocacy for Israel and causes that he cared about, and putting that story together was much harder even 5 years ago. Like we had like somewhat of a professional camera. The editing was hard because we wanted the quality to just be a little bit better than our iPhone whatever's at the time. This is only 5 years ago.
I know.
Yeah. Now, he's not going turning 100 on February 5th. and
Muck.
we
So
filmed him
exciting.
again recently. We filmed him again recently on the last 5 years of his life. He, went through COVID, he had great grandkids for the first time, and my iPhone quality was just like so much better in terms of video. So just like had a tripod for it. And there's now great like video editing AI tools that make it much easier to cut out, certain parts and add in some music and do some basic storytelling that we wanted to do. And maybe if I had looked into it a bit more 5 years ago, some of that existed then. But now it's just so much easier at everyone's fingertips. And because of AI and everyone thinking about it over 2023, people are getting more creative in how they can use it to help them tell stories. So, I didn't ask someone to make an AI version of my grandfather make up stories. I just filmed him and I need some help editing. And I think that is one great example where I think it's a really exciting time and we're going to see high quality stuff. Are there risks? Sure. Are there, job risks, fake news risks, fake content in general? Yes. But I'm a big believer and I optimistic that the same technologies that we're threatened about, we're also going to see them help us identify great stories too.
Okay, we had to pause the podcast to let you in on this opportunity. If you're ready to elevate your brand storytelling, don't miss our training, Tell Better Stories, led by me, a seasoned television journalist and PR professor, and Kyle, an on-air meteorologist and video storytelling expert. This workshop unveils our secrets to craft compelling, personal-driven narratives that resonate with your audience. Learn our distinct approach that puts people first and brands second, leveraging 6 storytelling elements for maximum impact. Walk away with actionable strategies, tactics, and a clear process to replicate success in any organization. Check out the show notes to learn more about this offer or reach out to homeplacecreative@gmail.com.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think that access allows people, both like you said, like, from filming, I remember I started out in television journalism and I had like always the big camera, like the giant one that had to sit on your shoulder. And now I saw people with DSLRs, and now when I speak to journalists, they are filming on their iPhones. So, and like you said, what an amazing gift to have the story of your grandfather and the interviews with him preserved for future family members. I think sometimes we forget how incredible that is that we can do that. And so I'm curious about with all that accessibility, speaking from the perspective of someone who wants to maybe do more of that professional storytelling, how do you break through the noise? How do you become, like you had mentioned, we talked earlier, if you might have the best, most creative story, but there's so many now possibilities to circulate that story, to get it out to what's your advice for somebody who maybe, again, is like, I have all these opportunities, I have all these avenues that I could pursue, right? I know I want to do storytelling. How do I narrow it down and be strategic about getting these stories out there? Finding my place in this giant media world that we're in.
Yeah. Well, I think not only meant to be a plug for Muck Rack, but whether it's Muck Rack or something else, like we believe a lot in this concept of, niching down and really making a media list, let's say very like quality over quantity, very short.
Sure.
So, if let's say you have something that you need to pitch that's in Miami, instead of pitching all the Miami journalists, find the Miami tech journalists of a tech product. But don't just find the Miami tech journalists, find the Miami tech journalists that cover health tech and make it really, really specific. So instead of having a list of 1,000 people that you're kind of spraying and praying with your list, really figure out who are the right journalists that are going to tell this story the best. Because it's going to be a lot more impactful if someone tells a really good story than it will be to just hope that, you're going to cast some wider net. It doesn't work. And even if you do get some responses, they're not going to tell the story that you want. So I think, the good news is there's so many opportunities, like you said, so much out there, but, nurturing it to a specific group is probably the harder part, but the most important part. So I think, realize that, from a PR perspective, getting in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal isn't the only goal. A lot of those journalists follow smaller podcasts and newsletters and sources to get their ideas, and something could eventually lead there. So that's probably the biggest advice that I have.
I think that's a great piece of advice to give people too. From the consumer side, so as someone who, created media, but also consumes media, what do you think? You mentioned, like, I know we mentioned fake news and, I think the need for media literacy, but what do you think as a consumer we need to watch out for or be aware of as we just talked about AI and as storytelling progresses? Because I think everybody is a storyteller. I think all of us have important stories to share. Maybe we don't always do it professionally, but yeah, I'm just curious to know, do you see anything that maybe makes you a little like apprehensive about things, or what should we be aware of and look out for on the horizon, if anything?
There's a lot that I'm, apprehensive and scared about.
Yeah.
While I think TikTok's an amazing platform and has, created all different new kinds of storytelling, I'm kind of terrified of my kids one day being on it, because
Mhm.
news spreads so differently there, and I don't think there's enough media literacy out there yet on how to identify what's fake or real. I'm not
Mhm.
one of these people who I don't believe at all that, like, oh, we should just ban TikTok.
Right.
I get why some people feel that way, but I don't think it's going to accomplish the goal. I think something new will come out that will
Yeah.
maybe be harder to teach.
Mhm.
I think, growing up, media literacy was pretty easy because generation above us had printed newspapers.
Mhm.
It kind of came out once a day, and you were, kind of taught how to read it, or like the hardest thing was like how to fold the newspaper on the subway in New York so you didn't bump into someone.
Yeah.
But now, identifying what's real and isn't, and it's easy to get, outraged and to repost content that you then end up telling a story about that you're not sure is true. So, I've had a lot of people close to me impacted, by the war between Israel and Hamas, and that I've really had to take a break from social media because I have Israeli friends, I have Palestinian friends, and it seems like the best thing to do, unfortunately, was to not um, follow anyone too closely, because I'm not sure that what I'm seeing is accurate or not. There's certain things which certainly are, following certain journalists or news sources. But personally, it was hard for me to, avoid friends I care about,
Mhm.
on both sides to do it. And I think that we require a lot more education and, not to use it like I said, but how to use it more positively, and how to identify what's true and what isn't, and not to only be, influenced by your close circle, or to be influenced by outrage. Because I think, posting about things you're outraged by, even if you should be, even if it's true, it's not going to change anything. I don't think. I think, so. In that sense, I'm apprehensive about it, but, I think it's possible to change things and to, create that kind of media literacy. I think there's great organizations doing it. I
Mhm.
think there's a generation of excuse me, parents like us who, probably care a lot about it and are going to be a lot more intentional with our kids than, our parents, who probably didn't know what really the internet was. They're like, sure, you could use this, and didn't really know what they were getting us into. The internet was a less scary place in
Yeah.
the 90s, although probably scary, but a less scary place. But now I think we're all a better educated generation about the internet because we grew up with it, and we're not going to hopefully let our kids go into that world without some kind of influence from their family values.
Yeah, thank you. I really thank you for sharing that perspective, Natan, because you kind of hit at the heart of what, like, I'm interested in curious about, which is, and this really, which is basically, how do we, or is it even possible to storytell? Because we know stories help us connect to other human beings, right? Because we see perspectives, we can become more empathetic. And I think a lot of that, when I hear people talk about storytelling in that way, it's that face to face or on a Zoom call, like we're on right now. But I'm curious because I wonder if social media Or, if we think about the evolution of the digital storytelling landscape, if there is that possibility there, like I think in certain circumstances it is. So, for example, I have a friend whose son was diagnosed with a brain tumor. So she was able to find these groups on Facebook of other parents, and that really became like a lifeline to her because she didn't have anybody in her immediate circle, right, that had experienced that. And so there's this really beautiful way to connect with people online. But on the flip side of that, as you had mentioned, I think what really became very obvious to everyone during COVID was or that time period we all lived through 2020. It seems it's hard to come to terms with the vitriol and how much you said like this rage posting, and you sort of find out things about people that you don't necessarily want to know, right? You're like, oh, I wish I didn't know that or see that. And so I'm just wondering, like, do you see the possibility for it to get better? Or do you think that we're going to continue on the way that we are? I know we're coming up on an election cycle. So I, like you, am thinking, okay, I have to put boundaries on, my social media use. And I don't want to limit like digital storytelling to social media, but it just seems like so much of it is that quick, so you don't get context. And I personally think there is opportunity there. I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are too. Cause right, sometimes I'm just like, oh, I don't know though, you know?
Yeah, I try and be an optimist. I agree
Yeah.
with you. I
Yeah.
mean, some things can seem pretty bleak, but I think there is an opportunity. I think going back to the TikTok example, as challenging as TikTok might seem to a generation who wasn't nascent to it. I think I see a lot of similarities into maybe how our parents felt about the internet, and
Yeah.
I feel like while yeah, TikTok's just one app on the internet. I think TikTok is more complex than the whole internet was in the 90s when we were first accessing it. So I think there's a degree to which dismissing something completely is not the right approach versus learning how to use it in a better way. But I don't know what's going to be out there next. I know for
Mhm.
sure that whatever my little toddlers use when they're teenagers is probably not going to be TikTok. They're probably going to be
Yeah.
making fun of all the older Gen Zs on TikTok. And I think it's intimidating and scary, but I also believe that the fact that we have so much information at our fingertips is going to help us decipher through things. But yeah, like you said, uncovering things about people you maybe didn't want to is challenging. And I think it's there's a lot of fear about if you post the
Mhm.
wrong thing,
Yes.
it
Yeah.
might impact what you do. So I think there's a whole new professional world that is a little bit overwhelming
Yeah.
to deal with. But I think great storytelling is in its still in its golden era.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I'm a big watcher of TV, and I think if you look at kind of what happened with the strikes and the TV industry and the writing, with the advent of streaming, there's just so many shows, so much
Mhm.
content, so much that happened, and they were all great. The problem was there's too much, and the legalese and actors and writers weren't getting compensated right. But it all kind of blew up into these unprecedented strikes that finally ended after 6+ months. And I think that that's testament to how much everyone cared about the storytelling. There were
Yeah.
so many great things happening. Everyone did a piece of it. Is AI going to affect it? And for me, as a consumer of it, I just want to continue to watch great TV.
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah, the days of, appointment television and everyone just watching The Sopranos and that being the biggest show, or Seinfeld or whatever it is, that's probably over for the most point, but that doesn't mean there isn't amazing content there. And I
Mhm.
think because there's all these new ways to go viral, to tell stories, streaming services get it out there, I think it's proof that how many great stories there are that are left to tell across all different genres, and that's why I don't see watching television as a passive mind number. I see it as important to my own creative juices to learn new things and get inspired by something and get into something and all that.
Yeah, I
That's
love
my
that.
excuse for watching too much.
No, I love that. No, I love that answer too. It is very optimistic. And I think that building off of that, do you have advice for, I also teach students who are at the cusp of their careers at this time. And they ask me a lot. I get the question a lot. Um, what should I share? I think they all know, as you mentioned, and this could go for adults too. I think people are apprehensive because we do have cancel culture and all that. But as you mentioned, there is this beautiful opportunity that has, not like any other time in history, is there for us to connect via our stories, right? And like you said, there are these platforms where we can find and share and be hopeful, and connect. So do you have advice about people who are just maybe putting themselves out there for the first time? And this is more of a personal branding question, but who are like, well, how do I curate my identity online so that I can connect and reach my goals and use it as a tool, not just use it as a tool strategically?
Yeah, yeah, it's really hard. I mean, yeah, cancel culture is a reality, and that our society is still kind of figuring out what to do with
Mhm.
it. I mean, I think in general, if something you're about to put out there publicly, if you're unsure about how it might resonate, or you feel even something in your gut, is this a little controversial, or I don't know, um, take a breath, like sleep on it, ask around, like don't rush to publish something, especially on social media. I think any so much of what gets posted online is a quick reaction to something without putting thought into it, and I think that's a huge problem that we have now, too, in terms of what one reshares.
Mhm.
So I sometimes reshare news articles, but they're after I've read them, after I've
Yeah.
like made sure this is something like I really believe in and I thought was a good article. Whereas I think most people will reshare things just based on the headline before they've actually read the article themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a huge problem what to get into. But in terms of your students, I think like um, you know, edit things, reread things, but ultimately believe in them and take into account if something you said might be offensive to someone, because I
Mhm.
think there's a chance it could be, but they're probably aware enough to know that it might be, and it's certainly something that's hard. I always wrote about industry news, where I'm sure everything is politicized and controversial today, but it's been
Mhm.
almost a decade since I've really freelance written, and I never really had to think too much about it, because it was very much like kind of B2B news that
Yeah.
um the biggest risk I was going to annoy someone was like a company that disagreed with my like review of their product, and I decided I was okay with that. But in terms of putting themselves out there, I think they're going to have to take risks, and they're going to have to believe in what they put out there, and they're going to have to know what their goals are with social media. If you're using social media personally, I recommend keeping accounts private.
Mhm.
That's a really important thing to do. But ultimately, if you're going to be public out there, be careful what you talk about. I think it's going to potentially come back to help you or haunt you forever.
I know. Yeah. And not to like end on such a, I know it's like it's hard to figure out, I think, because it's space, I think it's really exciting. This is kind of like a theme of our conversation too. I think it's a really exciting time to be a storyteller overall. Uh, but every exciting time has its risks and its challenges because we're sort of just figuring it out. Everybody's figuring it out. And as you said, we're one generation, like 20 years. It's so new when you think about it in the grand scheme of history. And so it's exciting time to be alive, but also challenging. Lots of things
Yeah.
to figure out and think through. So, but
Yes.
yeah, so appreciative of your time, Natan. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to add today to our conversation?
I'm trying to think. No, yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm happy you're doing this podcast. It's really important topics. The only other thing I'll kind of plug quickly is like, as a journalist or a writer, Muck Rack offers free portfolio tools. So if you need a place to organize all your published works, and you don't have time to make a website or resources to do it, I recommend organizing it on Muck Rack. But that's my little plug for our free tool for journalists.
Oh, that's a really cool, especially for, emerging journalists, people just starting. And
Yeah.
then that allows like PR folks to find you, right? Through the tool as well. They can.
100%. And
Yeah.
I think especially for like maybe your students or people that aren't like necessarily full-time journalists, but are starting to get published or write stuff, it's a good place to kind of keep your work organized. But yeah, and then get found and discovered.
Yeah. So it's kills two birds with one stone, if you will, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. We do
Exactly.
have like a couple rapid fire questions that we ask everybody at the end. So what
Great.
is your favorite story? So television, I'm guessing for you, it might be a television show, Natan, but movie, music, any form. What's your favorite one?
I was going to ask if I'm allowed to pick, a TV or movie. So while I'm a big TV guy, my favorite story all time is the Back to the Future trilogy. I'm a huge fan of the movies, just because I think from a storytelling perspective, and I'm a huge geek for the movie, but really all three movies are just a recycling of the same story.
Yeah.
There isn't a new story, it's just told in a different way, and I find that fascinating, how entertaining, using the same exact storyline, many of the same scenes and sets. So I find that really fascinating. And then there's also a lot of fun time travel and technology stuff, and
Yeah.
it's a kind of weird, quirky movie, the relationship between all the characters. So that's my all-time favorite story, and it's now a Broadway show.
I was just going to
and
ask
on the
you,
West.
have you seen it
Yeah.
on Broadway yet?
I saw it on the West End in London before it opened in Broadway.
Okay, cool.
And then I was there opening night in New York on Broadway.
Oh, that's so
Yeah.
cool. It's coming to Playhouse Square here in Cleveland this year. So we'll
We
definitely
must go.
Yes.
I'm biased, but they did a good job kind of like telling a story, but modifying it as needed for, the theater.
Cool. Oh, that's so neat. Yeah, that's a favorite in our house as well. The second question, we kind of went over some of this, but either pick the best or both, but the best storytelling advice you've ever heard, or the worst advice, just so bad you need to warn everybody about it in relation to storytelling.
Sure. So the best is probably the answer first communication piece. I was saying, like, really don't bury the lead, put it in and keep it short. That's also another part of it. So that's probably the best. The worst advice, I'm trying to think. The worst advice is probably pitch journalists on social media. I think like it sounds like maybe it's the right thing to do because so many journalists on it, but don't pitch journalists on social media unless they want you to. Use that to follow them and things like that if they want followers, but they'll use it to pitch. So that's another one.
Oh, that's a good piece of advice. Two good pieces of advice. And then the last one is, how do you define storytelling in your own words?
I define storytelling in my own words as, the process with which you communicate something that's extremely important, relevant, and timely. And that could be via news article, via an email, via presentation. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. I've been looking forward to this for a while and have really, really enjoyed our conversation, Natan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it too. And have a great rest of your day.
We're so glad you've listened to this podcast episode. If you liked it, would you mind doing us a favor? Share this episode with someone who would be interested in the topic too. We're on a mission to help everyone become a better storyteller. And don't forget to subscribe to the show to get updated every time we release a new episode. Each and every episode is produced, hosted, and edited by us, Meg and Kyle Adams at Home Place Creative. Happy storytelling.